And it all started with a rear wing. Not an engine. Not a driver. A rear wing. Ferrari built a system so extreme that the wing can rotate almost completely when the car enters a straight, nearly flipping its aerodynamic profile and potentially unlocking up to 10 km/h of extra top speed. In modern Formula One, that kind of gain is enormous. But here is where the story gets explosive. The moment rival teams realized Ferrari was bringing this Macarena rear wing to the Chinese Grand Prix, panic started spreading through the paddock. Engineers began analyzing the design. Teams started asking the FIA questions. And according to multiple paddock reports, Red Bull quickly moved to the front of a growing revolt against Ferrari's SF-26. Because if this system works the way Ferrari expects, it could completely change overtaking, completely change race strategy, and possibly give Ferrari the most dangerous straight-line weapon in the entire grid. But the most shocking part is this. The real reason Red Bull reacted so quickly is connected to something that happened during the Australian Grand Prix, a detail most fans completely missed. And once you see it, the entire situation suddenly makes sense. Australia looked like a normal season opener. The lights went out. The cars launched. And the 2026 era of Formula One officially began. For most fans watching the race, the focus was obvious. New driver lineups. New power unit balance. And one of the biggest stories in years. Lewis Hamilton driving for Ferrari. But inside the garages, engineers were not watching the race the same way. They were watching numbers, speed traces, energy deployment, drag levels. Because the new regulations changed something fundamental about Formula One. Straight line efficiency now matters more than ever. Less drag means more speed. More speed means more overtaking opportunities. And that is exactly where something interesting started to appear in the Australian Grand Prix data. Ferrari looked strong through the corners. The SF-26 had excellent traction. The car rotated well in medium speed turns. Both drivers looked confident pushing early in the race. Leclerc was aggressive. Hamilton looked surprisingly comfortable for a driver still adapting to a completely new car. At first glance, everything suggested Ferrari had built a serious contender. But when engineers looked deeper into the telemetry, another story appeared. On the longest acceleration zones, Ferrari was good. Very good. But not the best. Several cars were reaching slightly higher terminal speeds. And among them, one team stood out. Red Bull. Not by a huge margin. Not something obvious on television. But enough for engineers to notice. Enough to trigger questions inside Maranello. Because in Formula One, small differences repeated over an entire race become massive strategic problems. A few kilometers per hour advantage on every straight changes everything. It changes overtaking windows. It changes battery deployment strategies. It changes how teams defend. And Ferrari engineers realized something very quickly after Melbourne. Their car was strong. But on tracks with extremely long straights, they needed more. More efficiency. Less drag. More speed. That realization triggered a decision that completely changed the development timeline of the SF-26. Because Ferrari already had something waiting. Something radical. Something they had quietly tested months earlier during the Bahrain tests. A rear wing concept so unusual that when rival engineers first saw it, many thought it was experimental. Something for later in the season. Not something you bring to the second race of the year. But Australia changed everything. The data made the situation clear. If Ferrari wanted to fight Red Bull and the rest of the front-runners on high-speed circuits, they needed their most aggressive aerodynamic weapon immediately. And that is when Ferrari made the call. They accelerated the development schedule. They prepared multiple versions of the system. And they decided to bring the Macarena rear wing to the Chinese Grand Prix. But the moment that information began circulating through the paddock, something unexpected happened. Because rival teams did not just study the design. They started asking whether Ferrari had just discovered something far more powerful than anyone anticipated. And Red Bull, more than anyone else, understood exactly what that could mean. But here is the moment when curiosity inside the paddock suddenly turned into concern. Because once engineers from other teams finally understood how Ferrari's new rear wing actually works, the reaction was immediate. This was not a small aerodynamic trick. It was something much more aggressive. During the Bahrain tests earlier in the year, Ferrari had already experimented with a completely different philosophy for active aerodynamics. Instead of simply opening a slot in the rear wing, like the traditional drag reduction systems used in the past, Ferrari designed a mechanism capable of rotating the main wing element dramatically. Not a small adjustment. A massive movement. When the system activates on a straight, the main plane of the wing can rotate somewhere between roughly 180 degrees and almost 270 degrees. That means the aerodynamic profile of the wing almost flips. In corners, the wing produces strong downforce. The rear of the car stays planted, stable, predictable. But the moment the driver exits a corner and accelerates onto a straight, everything changes. The system activates. The wing rotates. Airflow reorganizes across the entire rear of the car. And the most important effect appears immediately. Drag almost disappears. Engineers in the paddock started describing the behavior in very simple terms. Corner mode and flight mode. Because in straight-line configuration, the wing is no longer pushing the car down into the asphalt with the same intensity. Instead, it nearly generates lift, which drastically reduces resistance against the airflow. The result is exactly what Ferrari wanted. Speed. A lot of speed. Early technical estimates suggested that in ideal conditions this concept could produce between 8 and 10 km per hour more top speed compared with more conservative active wing systems. In Formula 1, that difference is enormous. It can transform overtaking opportunities. It can allow drivers to defend much more easily. And it can completely change race strategy on circuits with long straights. Circuits like Shanghai. And that is precisely why Red Bull engineers started paying extremely close attention. Because they understand something that many people outside the sport underestimate. A small aerodynamic advantage is manageable. A massive drag reduction advantage is dangerous. Very dangerous. Especially under the 2026 regulations, where energy management and aerodynamic efficiency are tightly connected. If Ferrari suddenly reduces drag more effectively than anyone else, they do not just gain speed. They gain flexibility. They can deploy electrical energy differently. They can defend longer. They can attack later. And suddenly the balance of power across an entire race changes. That realization is what pushed Red Bull to begin asking deeper questions about the concept. Questions about rotation limits. Questions about structural behavior. Questions about how quickly the wing transitions between aerodynamic states. Because when a system rotates that aggressively, engineers immediately begin wondering about something very sensitive in Formula 1. Aeroelasticity. If the wing flexes even slightly under load, the aerodynamic behavior might change in ways that regulators never intended. That does not automatically mean the system is illegal. But it places the design right on the edge of the regulatory gray area. And whenever a design sits on that edge, Formula 1 teams react in a very predictable way. They start talking to the FIA. Quietly. Carefully. And according to several paddock insiders, Red Bull quickly became one of the teams leading those conversations. Not a formal protest. Not an official accusation. But a growing wave of technical questions. Because if Ferrari truly discovered a way to erase that much drag, the entire competitive order of the 2026 season could change overnight. And the Chinese Grand Prix was about to reveal whether that fear was justified. But the story becomes even more intense when you understand what Red Bull realized next. Because once Ferrari confirmed the Macarena wing would appear in China, engineers across the paddock began running simulations. Not Ferrari simulations. Rival simulations. Teams started feeding the concept into their aerodynamic models, trying to estimate exactly how powerful the system could become on a track like Shanghai. And the results made several teams extremely uncomfortable. Because Shanghai is not a normal circuit. The lap begins with long, sweeping corners that demand stable downforce. But after that comes one of the longest full throttle sections in the entire championship. A straight that stretches for more than a kilometer. Drivers sit at maximum acceleration for several seconds. And in that moment, aerodynamic drag becomes the single most important factor. If Ferrari's rotating wing truly enters what engineers describe as flight mode, the car could cut through the air far more efficiently than its rivals. That means something very simple. More speed at the end of the straight. Later braking points. More overtaking opportunities. And suddenly the entire race dynamic changes. This is exactly why Red Bull engineers became so focused on the concept. Because Red Bull's philosophy has always relied on aerodynamic efficiency. Their cars traditionally dominate through corners and maintain strong balance across different track types. But if Ferrari suddenly unlocked a massive straight-line advantage, that traditional Red Bull strength could be neutralized. Imagine a scenario where the Ferrari exits the final corner slightly behind a Red Bull. Normally, Red Bull's efficiency allows them to defend. But if the Ferrari suddenly gains several extra kilometers per hour halfway down the straight, that defensive advantage disappears. Overtaking becomes almost inevitable. And once engineers started calculating that possibility, the conversation inside the paddock changed dramatically. Because if Ferrari's advantage truly reached the predicted 8 to 10 kilometers per hour window, it would not just affect China. It would affect multiple races. Baku, Las Vegas, Monza, Spa. Any circuit with long straights suddenly becomes a Ferrari hunting ground. And that is exactly why Red Bull did not want to wait until several races later to raise questions. In Formula One, timing matters. If a design becomes dominant early in the season, it can shape the entire championship before rivals have time to respond. Development cycles are slow. Wind tunnel hours are limited. Budget caps restrict rapid redesigns. So if Ferrari discovered something revolutionary, Red Bull needed clarity immediately. That is why technical discussions with the FIA intensified before the Chinese Grand Prix weekend. Again, not a protest. Not an accusation. But a very clear message. Teams wanted to understand how far Ferrari could push this concept. Because if the Macarena wing delivered exactly what the early data suggested, then the Chinese Grand Prix would not just be another race. It would be the moment the entire Formula One grid realized the balance of power might be shifting.